ending, and we've definitely gotten a lot of great feedback and looking forward to hopefully making this an annual event. So, with that, just a little housekeeping. We do have a CCA credit available at the end of the webinar. And we will put this back up at that time if you don't get it now. But also, if you are in need of pesticide applicator training credits, you will want to send your information to Shannon, and you can see she's been putting it in the chat as well. So, and I'm sure she'll do that so that you can get pesticide applicator credits too. Okay. We also want to thank all the sponsors that we've had for the research and outreach work that we've been doing through UVM. And that includes the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Foods and Markets, the Northeast Extension Risk Management Education Program, the One Hive Foundation, and the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture. So, of course, got to thank them for supporting the research and the education. Let's see, we have one more day. Tomorrow we have, we're wrapping up talking about neonicotinoids. And I actually was just talking to Steve Dwinell, who's our guest today, and talking about doing some additional webinars possibly and outreach on the BMPs that we will be implementing, focused on minimizing, again, best practices. There we go. I got it. Best practices to minimize potential risks from neonicotinoids. So I believe, Steve, maybe you can give us a quick update. Those were just passed, so time to let people know what we need to be doing.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, so we went through a pretty extensive process of developing a set of recommended best management practices for the use of neonicotinoid treated seeds and neonicotinoid pesticides. Just completed that earlier this month, and now it's a rule on best management practice, and it actually goes into effect February 7th.
Oh.
And we'll be working with UVM, Heather and her colleagues on putting together a series of training opportunities for that best management practice rule.
Yep. Well, we're looking forward to that. So just a heads up for folks, you'll be hearing more about that in the very near future. Okay, well, with that, welcome, Steve. Steve Dwinell is joining us today. He's the Director of Public Health and Agricultural Resource Management Division at the Vermont Agency of Agriculture. It's been great working with Steve since he's been here in Vermont, which hasn't been too long, but it's been great working with him, and super collaborative, and just making a lot of good things happen, both for Vermonters, farmers, and others. So we appreciate your collaboration, Steve. Steve's going to be talking today about the Endangered Species Act and some new things we need to be doing here in Vermont related to that. And so we thought this is a great time to get everybody caught up on that topic. And I think, with that, Steve, I'm going to let you take it away. Are you sharing your presentation?
Yeah.
Or okay, all right.
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
Division of Plant Industry. Thank you,
Yes, I was
Matt.
about to say that. We changed our name in December from Public Health and Agricultural Resource Management, which is a mouthful, to something that's a little more succinct, which is Division of Plant Industry.
Okay, well, great. Thanks for that correction. I
Yeah,
appreciate it.
it'll take a while to sink in, probably.
It's still January, so
Yeah, I know. It just did it, so it's fine. I mean, well, it's been over a month, so it'll take time. But anyway,
Okay.
I'm glad to be
Well, when you're
here.
ready, go ahead and
Yeah, I'll go ahead
share
and
and
share. Uh, mm,
should be mine's at the bottom. There you go. Yeah. So for everyone on, if you can, type your questions into the chat, and we'll make sure those get answered at the end.
yeah,
Steve,
yeah,
time to give his presentation.
yeah. Thanks. And actually, Heather or Shannon, whoever, if I start running over
Yep,
allowable time, just let me know.
we will.
Yeah. So thanks for the opportunity. Glad to be here. Glad to talk about this. This is something that's been going on pretty actively since 2022, especially nationally, and it's a big change in the way pesticides are registered, approved for use, and will be in use. Primarily agricultural pesticides, but also it's being extended to other applications, other uses also. Um, and well, we'll just get into it. So, what this is all about is the fact that um, the Environmental Protection Agency, when they register a pesticide, they have to meet their obligations as a federal agency under the Endangered Species Act. And what that means is, so typically for the Endangered Species Act, when you think of federal agency meeting obligations, it's things like, if the Army Corps of Engineers are going to build a dam, they've got to do an endangered species evaluation and determine if the dam or project is going to result in what's called jeopardy or adverse habitat modification. That's called JAM. And, for decades, EPA attempted to meet that obligation by doing evaluations of individual pesticide active ingredients. They would spend a lot of time doing, collecting all the information about the effects of the pesticide on species, and then they would consult with either the National Marine Fisheries Services or the or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and those consultations could take literally decades to work through. So as a result of that, EPA was routinely getting sued for not meeting its obligations under the Endangered Species Act, and EPA was routinely losing those suits. So in their mid 2000s, they 2010 period going on, they started thinking about a different way to do this, and finally, after working on it for a long time, in 2022 they adopted a new strategy. And the strategy is, instead of evaluating pesticides on an active ingredient basis, they're going to evaluate uh, pesticides on a type of pesticide basis: a herbicide, a fungicide, insecticide. Um, and they have evaluated the potential. They've adopted a very protective approach to the potential impacts of those classes of pesticides on either endangered species or critical habitat. And the net result is there are new requirements for how and where these classes of pesticides can be used in order to be more protective of endangered species and or critical habitat. And it's a very, just front, just recognize it's a very broad approach. Okay, um, they adopted a strategy in 2022. The overall strategy, and what they've been doing since then is developing strategies for individual classes or types of pesticides. The first one they did was the herbicide strategy, which they finalized in August of 24. They did a thing called the Vulnerable Species Action Plan, which affected some. It was the way to address, I think, 28 very particular species. Didn't affect anything here in Vermont. There was a rodenticide strategy. It was finalized in November of 24. The insecticide strategy was finalized in April of 25. And we're anticipating the fungicide strategy, which would be the last strategy they publish in this coming March. So what does it mean? When it all boils down to, what it means is that EPA, when they're registering one of the pesticides that fall into those classes, they have to consider possible impacts to endangered species and critical habitat during the registration or the re-registration process. And just as a side note, pesticides have to go through a re-registration process every 15 years. So if they're registered, then before 15 years is up, EPA has to go back and look at them again and apply any new information or new knowledge about pesticide impacts in that process. The protective measures that EPA decides to adopt are going to be on the label of the pesticide or published in what are called bulletins, which are geographic specific sets of requirements for the use of those pesticides, and they're available on a website called Bulletins Live 2, which we'll spend some time talking about. But the key message or the key thing to understand is that there is going to be, and there already are, directions for use on labels that are responsive to EPA's evaluation of potential risks. And these are directions and directions for use and mitigations that have never been on labels before. So it's a whole new thing. It's equivalent for the folks who do pesticide regulation. We consider it equivalent as a big change as the introduction of the worker protection standard, a couple decades ago. So it's a big change. So what are the risk reduction measures that are going to be in broad terms that are on the labels? And there are two broad categories. One is what are called drift mitigation measures, and we'll spend some time talking about them. But they are buffers of various sizes that are going to be a minimum buffer that you have to apply or use when you're applying the pesticide for the crop that's labeled. And then another set called interim ecological mitigation measures, which are soil erosion and runoff mitigations. Again, they'll be required on the label, and those are site specific, and they require that these mitigations be in place before the application is made. And the key point about that is because they're on the label, they're required and they're enforceable for pesticide users. Excuse me. So let's talk about drift mitigation buffers first. So again, on the label, as a result of the process EPA goes through when they're doing these risk evaluations, they will require a certain minimum drift mitigation buffer during the application of the pesticide. This is an entirely different type of drift mitigation or a drift requirement than exists on a label already. In general terms, you're not, drift off of the application site is not allowed during application, and the applicator has to ensure that the application is made in such a way that drift doesn't occur. This is different because even whether or not drift occurs, you still have to have this buffer. So whether or not conditions are such that you're going to minimize drift, or you're taking precautions relative to wind speed and that kind of thing, you still have to have a minimum spray buffer established when you make the application. That buffer can be made up of areas in the field that you didn't treat. As for this example, the minimum buffer is 50 feet, and you can meet that requirement by any combination of an untreated area of the field, some set aside like conservation reserve program land, or a planted windbreak or whatever you've got. But you've got to have a minimum distance where the application is not made as a buffer distance. It gets more complicated because EPA allows reduction in the minimum required buffer if certain practices are followed. You can use a higher or a larger droplet size to reduce. If you use a larger droplet size so the drift is less likely, you can reduce the buffer distance. You can use different combinations of application equipment. You can use things like hooded sprayers. There are a number of options, excuse me, that EPA has built in to the process so that the quote unquote minimum required buffer distance can be reduced. And you can reduce it up to 100% if you combine these practices. And EPA actually has, because it's so complicated, EPA has established on their has a website with a drift buffer calculator where you can enter in the factors to determine the minimum buffer that you need to maintain. So that's the buffer. The other group of protective measures that is appearing on labels is a requirement for certain soil erosion and water runoff mitigation practices that have to be in the field before the application is made. EPA adopted a point system to make it easier to understand, I guess. And the point system, what it does is it says in order to make this application, you have to have a minimum number of points on the application site in order to use the product. And the point levels are based on an evaluation of the potential risk of the pesticide to either listed species or critical habitat. And what this table shows is the range of the possible points, anywhere from no points to 9 points. So the most points that can be required on a pesticide label to meet the risk reduction goals is 9 points. So if you're able to achieve 9 points on the field, then you can apply the product. And each product has a different number of points, and I'll show some examples. These are just examples. This isn't the complete list. EPA has a website, which I'll show you in a minute, where it lists all the different possible ecological mitigation measures, but these are just examples of things that can be used to meet the requirement to meet a certain minimum number of points. Vegetative filter strips, field borders, contour farming, cover cropping. These are practices that are already in place for a lot of fields in order to meet soil erosion or nutrient management plan requirements. So a lot of the fields already will have these in place. It's just a matter of knowing what's in place and whether the combination of what's in place will meet the minimum required number of mitigation points for the use of that product. And again, we'll show you some examples. This is just language that is appearing on labels right now, actually in Vermont. And so on the section of the label, there's a section that says mandatory runoff mitigation. And again, these are enforceable requirements. So what the label says is you must achieve a minimum of 3 points for the crop uses in order to use this product. You can meet those 3 points in a number of different ways, but you have to have a minimum of 3 points before you can use the product on the crop that you're using the pesticide. Again, just like the drift buffer determining the size of the drift buffer, EPA has established a calculator that you can use. They list all the different mitigation options. You can go through them, and then you can use a drift a mitigation calculator to determine if the particular field. Let me just show that real quick. This is what the mitigation calculator looks like. It can either be done, you can print it off and do it manually, or you can run it on the website. And there are a number of organizations that have taken this and sort of made their own way to do this. So folks are trying to make it easy to get to and easy to calculate. But we can, can answer questions about that. One thing to keep in mind or to be aware of, I guess, is that EPA also established what are called mitigation relief points. So based on a modeling of the soil types and the runoff and the rainfall, depending on the fact that you're in a particular county in the U.S., you'll get a certain number of mitigation points right off the bat. And these are the mitigation points that are available just by virtue of your location in Vermont. So, for example, Addison County, just if you're farming in Addison County, you get 2 points right off the bat. Orange County, you have 3 points of that particular label example. If you're farming in Orange County, you've already met the minimum required number of mitigation points that you're supposed to meet. Some of the other counties don't have that luxury. Quite a few of the counties have 0 points by virtue of the location, and those counties then have to, if you're farming in that county or using that product in that county, you're going to have to make up the points through some other mitigation measures. To make it even more complicated, so there are certain situations where you don't need any mitigation points, and that essentially is if the water on the property is controlled through a perimeter burn system, or a tile drain that's also includes a water controlled structure or a controlled outlet. The application's made in such a way that you're not going to have application to soil directly, surface soil, so a soil injection or a tree injection or chemigation, if it's under plastic mulch. So there's a number of exceptions. So if you're having an application in one of these scenarios, then you don't have to meet the 3 mitigation points. Yeah, and this is the calculator you can use to determine how many mitigation points your field has. So just like I showed you the language for the that's appearing on labels for the mitigation points, this is language that is appearing on labels now for mandatory spray drift buffers. So for this particular product, if you're doing a ground application, you have to have a minimum of 10 foot minimum buffer distance when you make the application. Again, that minimum buffer distance can be reduced, and there are on the label they'll list the ways you can reduce it and the types of areas that can be included in the buffer, like agricultural fields, roads, buildings and perimeters, areas maintained as a mitigation measure. I guess I know I'll probably say this multiple times, but the takeaway is these things are on the label and specifically directed toward the applicator, and they are enforceable and they have to be followed when making an application. So the other component of this is that a determination as to whether you've met the minimum mitigation points has to be made for each application site and by the applicator. So some of these mitigation measures are obviously practices that the farmer implements or they're practices that the farmer has. But if the farmer isn't the applicator, if it's a custom applicator coming in, the applicator has to determine if those conditions exist. And that's going to complicate and is complicating the use of custom applicators to make applications, because it's on the applicator to determine if the field where they're doing the application has the necessary number of mitigation points in order to meet the application. And when we do a pesticide use inspection, we're going to have, if that's on the label, we're going to have to verify that, first of all, the site met the requirements, and we're going to have to verify that the applicator, because it's the applicator that's liable for compliance with what's on the label, how if and how the applicator verified that the field had the necessary number of points. And there are various ways to do that. Same thing with the pesticide drift buffer. If we do a pesticide use inspection, we're going to have to determine if during the application, the drift buffer that's required on the label was in place, or if they were able to reduce the size of the buffer based on a number of factors. So those are all things that we're going to have to determine if the application was made in accordance with the label. So this language is appearing now. These are the first three products there. These are products that if you pull the label for these products, it will be on the label. They're mandatory mitigation measures or a minimum drift buffer. The big one, which I'll talk about a little bit further, is atrazine. There's a proposal that EPA has made to include language like this on the atrazine label. Carbaryl methanol, there's some others. And this table's probably out of date a little bit. I didn't update it in the last month. But another takeaway from here is that pretty much every agricultural label that's going to be coming out, any new product or any re-registered product will have this language on the label. So if you're any pesticide application, especially in agriculture, you're going to have to review the label to determine if the language is on there, and then follow the requirements of that on the label. So atrazine, what EPA has proposed, and it'll show up here at some point when EPA gets done with their process, is that they're going to add a section on mandatory runoff mitigation on the atrazine label, and there'll be requirements for mandatory mitigation and a cap on the amount that can be applied. And for Vermont, I think it'll be 2 pounds of active ingredient per acre. The reason they're doing this is that as a result of a lot of work done on atrazine, they've done modeling and determined that the areas that on this map, as a result of the modeling, that the average 60-day concentration in those receiving waters will be for the purple areas between 9.7 and 45.4 micrograms per liter, and in the green areas they can be greater than 45.4 micrograms per liter. And the whole purpose of this mitigation approach is to reduce the concentration that can occur in the surface water. And so what they've done is if you're in an area where the modeling shows that you can achieve levels between 9.7 and 45.4, then you're going to have a certain set of mitigation measures. If you're in areas that are you could have higher concentrations, you have a different set. For Vermont, we're all in the purple, which is less than 45.4. So they've identified these 3 counties on their modeling, based on their modeling, that will require 3 points of mitigation: Addison, Franklin, and Rutland. The other counties, because of their modeling and the characteristics of the soil and rainfall and that kind of thing, you don't have any additional mitigations you have to meet on the atrazine label. So 3 points in order to use atrazine once the label gets issued. In these 3 counties, you're going to have 3 points of mitigation in order to use the product. Okay, so there's another whole thing, another whole set of requirements that EPA's adding to the labels. In addition to the drift buffer and the mitigation measures, mandatory mitigation measures, there's a requirement that if pesticide use occurs in some very specific geographic areas that are either identified as critical habitat for listed species or where the listed species could occur, there's an additional set of requirements, and those are published as a separate document called a bulletin, and they're on the website. The bulletin's live too. And the label, the way that's implemented is each label, and this is starting to showing up on a lot of products already. And what it says is that if you use this product, you must follow the measures contained in the Endangered Species Protection Bulletin for the area where you're applying the product. Before using this product, you must obtain a bulletin within 6 months of the day of application. And to obtain the bulletin, you have to go to a website, or you have to go to a website and download the bulletin, and then you have to follow the measures in the bulletin, which are in addition to or supplant the measures that are otherwise on the label regarding timing and application and protective measures you have to take. So the bulletins apply in geographic areas called pesticide use limitation areas, or PULAs. Excuse me. And you can obtain them, and you can look for the location where you're going to make the application by going to this website, drilling down and finding if the area you're going to make the application is in a PULA. If it's in a PULA, you have to download the bulletin and you have to follow the instructions that are on the bulletin, which are in addition to what's on the label. This is an example of what it looks like if you did this. You can see, so when you drill down into the website, geographically, you'll see areas that are colored in these polygons, and in those polygons is where the bulletins apply. So if you're in one of those areas, you got to download the bulletin and follow the instructions. For Vermont, right now, there are no PULAs in Vermont. We have no pesticide use limitations established in Vermont. New York has them, New Hampshire has them, Maine has them. All on the coast, essentially, they've established PULAs along the essentially the water bodies that empty into the ocean because of the potential for impact on salmon and a couple other species. And so if you make applications in those areas and you have to drill in to see them, then you have to follow the bulletin language for those. But again, there are no PULAs in Vermont right now. Now, that can change at any time. When EPA goes through the process of consulting with the National Marine Fisheries Service or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they may establish a PULA. Now, we've been working at the national level with the other pesticide regulators to make sure we have some notice if that happens. Right now, it's a little fuzzy, and there have been cases in other states where PULAs have been established, and then everybody finds out after the fact that PULA's in effect, and then has to scramble to figure out what to do. But hopefully we'll get a situation where EPA gives us a heads up that they're considering a PULA, and then we can adapt. So one last thing, hopefully it's not too complicated, but one of the things EPA just recently did is they added a opportunity that if you're enrolled in a qualified conservation program, then you are considered to meet all the possible mitigation requirements for the soil erosion and water runoff. And the only one that they've identified that meets that is the NRCS EQIP program. So if you're in an EQIP program and the EQIP practices were developed with the consideration of pesticide use, and there's a particular way they do that, then you already meet all the requirements. So I know that was a lot, and it's not easy. It's complicated and a lot of new concepts. So hopefully it wasn't too confusing. And we'll just see if people have questions.
Are some questions, Steve? They're starting to come in. So
stop sharing here.
yeah. So folks, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We do have plenty of time to answer those. So let's make sure everybody understands what Steve is presenting here. Okay. So what kind of land use will most Vermont growers be setting their buffers from? Surface water?
Okay, so you don't set buffers from area. You have a buffer. The buffer starts at the edge of the field where you're making the application. So if you've got a field, and say you have a minimum 10-foot buffer, the 10-foot is you have to have 10 feet from the edge of wherever you're making the application. So the simplest case would be if you just leave 10 feet untreated in the field, then you've got your 10-foot buffer. You can use other land uses to make up that 10-foot buffer. For example, if you have a building site, you have buildings, farm buildings, the farm buildings could be included in that 10-foot. If you have uh, land that's in conservation reserve program that meets certain characteristics, you can use that. If you have a field right next to the field you're treating, that field could be part of the 10-foot. There are lots of different ways to do it. So you're not looking at you have to start where you're making the application. You don't start at um, the water body or whatever it is you're trying to protect. Does that make sense?
Emily, does that answer your question?
And let me just say this too. This is complicated stuff. Okay. Anybody who is looking to comply and doesn't quite know what to do, I mean, give me a call. I will walk you through the calculator. I've done that a couple of meetings nationally, and you have to sit down and you actually have to look at the calculator and you have to work through it to see what it is. Once you do it, it's not that hard, but it sounds complicated up front. But once you do it, it's not that hard. And actually, what we need to do is work with UVM to show growers and applicators individually. We've been working with trying to set up some meetings with the certified crop advisors to actually show them how to use the calculator. And once you do it, it's not that hard. So,
Yeah, the menu's not that bad. I was just wondering, so like you're setting up the buffer from where you're applying. How do you know
right.
when you've hit something that you're not including in your buffer? Does that make sense? Like, because it's defined as
Well,
what's
you have to
included in the
treat.
buffer, but not what's protected.
Yeah, don't think about the protected area. Think about the distance from the end of the sprayer. So you roll into the field, the end of your boom, you walk 10 feet. Okay. And if that 10 feet includes any of the things that are listed on the label, that's okay. If it's one of the things that's not listed on the label, then you can't use it and you have to back up a few feet, right?
Got it. Okay,
So,
that's helpful. Thanks.
yeah.
Okay. Um, Steve, you mentioned the calculator.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a link or?
Yeah, and we can put it in the chat or however you want
Okay.
to do it.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's two particular websites that you can click on and it pops up and you can start filling it out.
Okay.
Or
All right.
download it and fill it out manually.
All right. So Myra has a question. Will applicators have to be certified in this knowledge of determining mitigation options as well as being certified applicators?
No, there's no specific certification, but certification is intended to train people to read the label and understand it. And so it's going to have to become part of the training for the certified applicators. And it just goes back to what everyone always says: read the label. So read the label. And if you have a question about a means, call Heather or
Yeah. Right.
or call me.
Right. Right. Okay. So if the label requires checking BL2, do
Voltage
growers
Live
still,
too. Yeah.
yep, do growers still have to even, do growers still have to, even though we know there are no PULAs in Vermont.
Yeah,
So
PULAs.
maybe define all that stuff again, Steve.
Yeah, so a PULA is a pesticide use limitation area, and those are
Right.
geographic areas established by EPA because they're either where a listed species can occur or critical habitat can occur. And so they want to protect that critical habitat or that species from the pesticide application. So they establish additional requirements. So that the label says you must check, okay? That is a question that we're wrestling with at the national level. We actually have a meeting coming up in February where we're going to be talking about that. Like, what does that mean? I think as a practical matter, we are not going to go around, we can't go around and check to see if anyone's checked it or downloaded a bulletin. But if it ever, in the process of a pesticide use inspection, if we determine that requirements on a bulletin were not followed, that would be one potential violation of the label, that you didn't check the bulletin.
Okay. So what records then do applicators need to keep to meet inspection enforcement requirements?
That's an excellent question. There are no specific record keeping requirements on the label, but we recommend, and we need to recommend in our training, that people keep records of the types of mitigation measures that they have in place on the field and how they calculated the buffer. So again, that's something that we're wrestling with at the national level. We got a meeting coming up in May in Washington just to figure out how inspectors can find that out, because there are no specific record keeping requirements. And what it's going to boil down to is, when we go in to do a pesticide use inspection, we're going to have to, instead of saying, show me the records of your drift buffer, we're going to ask, how did you calculate the drift buffer? And if the applicator kind of just stares at you, then you probably know you got a problem and they don't know what you're talking about. But if they say, oh, I calculated it by, the wind was blowing southwest and I, marked off 10 feet, and that's how I did it, and then we're getting somewhere. But there are no specific record requirements. The recommendation is to keep records of any mitigation measure that you've employed, like a cover crop, or if you're enrolled in EQIP or whatever you're doing, if you have those records. We have a little advantage here in Vermont because of the cost share programs we have for the nutrient management plans and the soil erosion control, stuff like that. And we can get those records, or the farmer will have those records. So we're probably in pretty good shape on that. Probably the trickiest thing is going to be the drift buffer determination, especially in apple production for the air blast sprayers, because those have larger drift buffers than ground application and fewer options for minimizing the amount. So yeah, it's going to be an experience. We're going to have to adapt and learn and educate.
So I see Sarah Kingsley Richards is on. Sarah, I'm assuming this is a topic that will be covered at the upcoming trainings for pesticide applicators. Is this correct?
Correct. We will be covering it in our initial certification. We also have another webinar coming up on March 3rd. We have a guest speaker, Brett Bultmeyer from Florida. He's very charismatic and very knowledgeable about this topic. And he will give everybody an opportunity to hear all about it again.
Yep. He's great.
So,
done a lot of work in Florida.
Sarah, I know you've sent us that information and we're distributing it through our networks, but
I can post a link in the chat.
Yeah, if you could post a link in the chat, because I feel like this is a topic, and I know we talked about this before. It's like people need to hear it, then they need to hear it again, and then it's new. We gotta learn about it, and that kind of takes time. So I think another opportunity or two is a great thing. So if you don't mind
Thank you.
sharing that in the chat, that would
I
be
will
super.
share the pesticide program homepage. This is the first of a series of
Okay,
IPM webinars that folks could join in as well and get pesticide credits.
great. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I see there's another question about how do the ESA drift buffers interact with interact with or differ from the buffers for bee toxic pesticides in Vermont rules?
Okay, well, that's a great question. The simple answer is they're entirely different and they all apply. So you got to do it all.
Yeah, buffer on buffer on buffer.
Right, but I mean they're different. So the for pesticides that are acutely toxic to bees, there's a certain set of buffers. So you got to meet that. Okay. Chances are, if you do that, you'll already have met the mandatory drift buffer for anything on a ESA label. Likely, but the ESA drift buffer applies to pesticides that aren't highly toxic to bees. So there's a subset of pesticides that are highly toxic that the pollinator protection buffers apply. The mandatory drift buffers are going to apply to essentially everything else. So yeah, they're different. And in addition to that, there's still a requirement that you don't drift off site. Okay, so if we find drift off of the application site or off the property, then that's a whole different thing. So there are three different things going on with drift now. So basically, don't drift.
So what, Emily, maybe you can type in what are the buffers for bee toxic pesticides in Vermont rules? Or Steve, somebody or whoever.
Yeah, they're in the rule. I don't have the rule here next to me. It's
Emily doesn't either. Okay.
I'd have to
5.07.
follow up, but it's like 50
right.
feet from natural, semi-natural areas, I want to
Yeah.
say.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a whole, and actually, I think Laura Johnson, if she's on, actually prepared has a document that explains it for folks how to comply.
Yes, I have a, I think, frequently asked questions document.
Right.
Could you share that, Laura? Oh my goodness, we got to have a.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, this is great. Lots of stuff new things to learn about, but also thinking about all the different pieces that have to be put together here. Interesting. Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Emily.
Sorry for all the questions.
No, it's great.
I was curious if you thought, and I couldn't figure out how to word it in the chat. So do you see the burdens of implementation for these new ESA mitigations falling on like particular kinds of growers or particular, like if it's on the applicators to maintain an understanding of the field level mitigations, is it really going to fall on the custom applicators that are doing this on many fields where this burden might be falling? Or is it on a grower that's on a slope field, no tile drainage? Right. Just curious.
So, yeah, the point we're trying to make and educate people, it's the applicator who has to figure it out. Okay. So the farmers, if a farmer's doing their own application, they have to follow a label and they'll know a lot. If it's a custom applicator and they're treating a lot of different fields, that's obviously a different problem. A lot of folks are wrestling with that now, especially in the Midwest, where you've got hundreds of custom applicators. They're actually developing software programs. There's another element to this that we'll have to have a webinar on this at some point, but we're just kicking off the Field Watch program here in Vermont. And the Field Watch program allows applicators, if they're enrolled in the program, to actually pull up specific fields and look at them before they go out and treat and determining what's going on with that field. So there are lots of ways to do this, but it is the applicator that has to determine if the application site meets the requirements of the label. So yeah, they have a bigger burden than a farmer doing their own application.
Ooh, okay. Well, thank you, Laura, for putting that into the chat for reference for folks. I think this is great. Wow, that's a lot to consider here. So right now, who's who's liable at the end of the day for implementing this? I think is a
The
question
applicator.
that people would ask, right? I mean, oftentimes we have different types of service providers, providing services to farms. Um, you trust that they know the rules, the regulations, whatever, their expertise is. But at the end of the day, who does the liability fall on?
The applicator.
The
Whoever is
application.
applying the pesticide has to comply with the label, period.
Yep.
And so, if an applicator goes out there and doesn't meet the requirements, then they're the ones who have not complied with the label,
Yep. Okay. I thought that was the case, but just wanted to clarify that. And again, if you're an applicator, there'll be another. I mean, I know, Steve, you're trying to get the applicators together, but there sounds
Right.
like there'll be some other opportunities for folks to learn more. And, I think one of the things I've been learning and learning and learning, and maybe continuing to learn, is the importance of records in all of the things that we do on our farms and as service providers. Like, although it seems like this huge onus, and most people don't like to keep records, including myself. But at the end of the day, that is often your protection and your evidence that you have done what you were supposed to do. And so just an emphasis on record keeping and keeping really good records, because it can
And
really help.
reading the label.
What's that?
Read the label.
Yes, and read the label. I know.
Right.
And labels they're fascinating documents. There is a lot to learn every time I read one. I think, wow, this is really informative.
Yep.
Therefore,
And
Sarah, go ahead.
can I just put in a plug? If you're not a certified applicator already, a lot of private applicators aren't required to be certified unless they're applying restricted use products. But I'm really starting to push certification for anybody who applies a pesticide. It's a lot of good education on good best management practices, and it taps you into a network of continuing education on these products. So if you're not already a certified applicator, I'm encouraging it, and it's not a huge financial burden, and it kind of also is a good incentive to keep better records because they check those.
Right. And also, in case anyone's not aware, you can take the certification exams online. So it's a lot easier to do than it has been in the past, where you had to attend, actually go to a location and sit for the exam. You can do
Yeah.
the exams online anytime.
All right. Well, this is great. Anything else, Steve, you want to let folks know about on this topic or any other topics going on in your division, before we hop off for the day?
Well, just appreciate the opportunity. I mean, there's a lot going on. We need to keep educating as much as possible. We're going to have to do series on the best management practices. The labels, I get involved with the EPA on the national level. On we have conferences and everything. They've got a lot of new products coming down the pike. A number I heard was 85 new active ingredients.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So, there's a lot of change that will be happening over the next few years. on the pesticides that are available, the products, the modes of action, the use directions, and it's only going to get more complicated. So people really need to pay attention, and we're here to provide as much information as we can, and we really appreciate the partnership we have with UVM on getting the word out.
Awesome. Sarah, anything on your end you want to share before we close out for the day? Maybe just introduce yourself so folks that don't know you know your role here.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. My name's Sarah Kingsley Richards. I'm with the University of Vermont Extension Pesticide Safety Education Program, which is not in the business of working with specific pesticides in crops, but we're here to help you navigate the certification and recertification process and to offer a lot of education, continuing education opportunities for certified applicators and to help answer questions, not what pesticide should I use for this application, but how do I choose the right pesticide? How do I navigate all this terminology? And just general, like I said before, best management practices when it comes to handling pesticides. So
Yep.
That's what I'm here for. And I work very closely with the Agency of Ag and Steve and the certification and training program to get the word out about these best management practices and the new rules and the regulations and things like ESA that are coming out. And serve the applicators. And if you're not certified, you're not as high up on our radar, which is another reason I encourage certification, so you can tap into the services that are being offered to applicators, which apply to any pesticide, whether it's organic or conventional synthetic pesticides. So
Great.
there you go.
Sarah. Yeah, no, appreciate it. Shannon, if you have a minute to put up the QR code. This is great. Thank you so much, Steve and Sarah and everybody that chimed in with the great questions. You do receive one CCA credit for today. And again, if you need pesticide credits, you can send an email to Shannon as instructed. I'm going to get my credit and put my phone up now. And then, yeah, we will see hopefully everyone tomorrow. We'll be hearing from Dr. Katya Pravida from Cornell. She'll be giving us an update on the neonicotinoid research being conducted in New York. And then I will also be providing an update on the work that we've been doing here. So we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. And thank you, Steve, again. And we look forward to putting together some information on the BMPs for neonicotinoids. So
Yep.
people can look forward to that. All
All right.
right.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.